Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hi, friend, and welcome to episode 104. I am here today with Holly. Hey, Holly.
Hey!
And if we sound different, it's because we are both in my bedroom.
Sitting on your bed.
That's right. We're podcasting in person today. Woo-hoo! And Holly didn't bring her mic with her, so we are using my old mic.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. And anyway, so we can't promise that this episode is going to sound the best, right? But we're trying our best to be in a space where it'll sound good. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. And you might want to go back a few episodes and listen to something other than this one for today.
Have it all together.
Yes. But anyway, what we're going to be doing today is kind of having a little bit of a more casual conversation. Yeah. We definitely do not have this episode as planned out as we usually do, but we just want to talk about, kind of the current events, all the things that have been going on lately that have been affecting us as leaders and affecting our country and our world, and then kind of talk about how we as individual leaders can be responding to these things. So before we do that, though, we want to just tell you a couple ways that if you enjoyed this podcast, that you can support the podcast and keep it going. Because we've mentioned this before, but podcasting, while it's free for you to listen, it's not free for us to produce. And so we have a couple different things that we offer for ways you can support. So Holly, do you want to mention those?
Yeah. So first thing and the most recent thing that we've launched is our merch store.
Yeah.
So there's shirts there. I believe that there's a mug there, and they have some really great, just great content, great designs on them. And of course, you will look adorable in them, just like us.
Can I tell a story about that?
Yes.
So I ordered one of the shirts, which Holly and I collaborated and designed the things together. So one of the designs I was wearing, and I went to pick up takeout a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And this woman looked at me and she was like, "Oh my word, I love your shirt."
That's awesome.
So
we said earlier that you should have told her where you got it.
I know. I should have said, yeah, I designed it, and here's where you can buy it.
I have yet to order anything. I need to do that, but we were on our way here, so I didn't want it to go there and then get lost.
Right.
So I'll be getting some stuff. But if you're not in our Facebook group, then you should be in our Facebook group, because we're showing what our merch looks like.
Right.
And you can get a sneak peek. But you can also check the show notes for a link to our merch store. And then the second way that you can support the podcast is becoming a podcast partner. And the great thing about that is you get a bonus podcast feed specifically for those people who decide to support. So if you cannot get enough of us, this is another way to get more of Esther and Holly, which I know you all want in your earbuds.
And of our guests.
Yes,
because we do what we've been doing actually mostly is with our guests. After we record the regular episode, we are recording a mentor moment with them. So we're asking them some kind of lightning round questions that maybe you would want to hear their answers to, if you were to sit down with them for coffee or something like that.
Right.
And we've actually just recently been throwing in a fun question for them, like we do at the end of our episodes together. So we would love to have you be a podcast partner. You can, again, go right to the show notes for this episode, and you'll see a link to support the podcast, and it will walk you through it. Super easy. It's $5 a month, and it's just a little bit that kind of shows you that you are believing in what we're doing, but also you get something in exchange for supporting the podcast.
Yeah, so we would totally appreciate that if you would be interested.
Exactly. All right, so let's kind of talk about our topic for today, right? So
let's get into it.
Let's get into it. what we wanted to do is kind of just talk about how are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, how are you actually doing as leaders right now? As a woman in leadership, whatever your role is, all of us in one way or another have been significantly impacted, I think, in 2020 with things that in January, we really had no idea.
We didn't know it was coming.
So obviously you probably know, but we're just going to talk about a few of the things that have been impacting us. So the first one would be COVID-19.
Obviously,
right?
yeah. That's been a big one.
Yeah. And it still feels somewhat surreal, like how everything has happened with that. But I remember flying back from Chicago in March and coming back from a conference. And on the way home, it was like I was looking at the news feed and seeing news links come up and stuff like that. And I was realizing, oh, something is like, this is becoming a bigger deal than what I thought when I left Maine for Chicago.
Yeah.
And, then within 3 days, everything was shutting down.
Well, and I think too, it kind of also depends on where you live because different states are handling it so differently.
Yeah.
And so if you're listening to national news and you're also listening to your state news and local authorities, they all have a little bit of a different tone and a little bit of a different way that each state and region is handling it. So even within the fact that the whole United States, it felt like was shutting down, different places were handling it so differently. I know in Tampa, there were some nights that we had curfews and, different atmospheres in different places, just to go get groceries just felt weird.
Right.
So handling all of that has been a lot and it's been difficult and it's unprecedented for our generation.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's affected, especially if you're in church ministry, like my husband and I are. I know a lot of our listeners are in ministry of some kind involved in churches. And I mean, that has made a massive impact on churches. It's made a massive impact on the fact that most schools, if not all schools, have basically shut down from mid-March until the end of the school year. And then we don't even know what it's going to look like in the fall. And then that means that for many of us, kids have been at home needing to try and quote unquote school, attend school while many parents are still having to work. And, we're not telling you things that you don't already know, but we're just kind of wanting to recap some of the ways that we have all been under a very different amount of stress and change than we normally are. Yeah. Right?
And so, you may have lost your job or be a part of a family that has a job loss.
Yes.
And that is a huge weight. Just, not even worried about whether or not you might contract COVID-19. Like, how am I going to put food on the table? Like, these are very real concerns for people who, 3-6 months ago weren't even considering that. Things were looking pretty great maybe. So,
yeah. So, and then obviously, if you listen to the podcast, last week we did an episode on racism and we talked with my friend Shannon. So if you haven't listened to that, I really want to encourage you to go back and listen to that. But everything that has happened in the past few weeks with George Floyd being murdered and then all of the things that have come as a result of that horrific event and the protests, and there's been the rioting and the looting. But again, a lot of this has impacted our country in a severe way. And I know not everybody that listens to this show is in the United States, but probably a vast majority are. And if you're not, you probably have heard about what's going on. And so that, again, has been something that has been a very significant, I don't want to say event because it's not just an event, but like a situation that is impacting the church, it's impacting our culture and us as individual leaders as well. And I think that one thing that I've noticed out of all of this happening is just how polarized and how divided we are a lot of times as a church, but also as a nation. Just going through my social media feed, it feels like a minefield of differing views and disagreements, meaning we're no longer friends and just all kinds of things.
I feel like people's opinions have ramped up to critical mass, if you will, as in people are really drawing a line in the sand and saying, if you don't agree with me, like you said, we can't be friends. And so it just feels really, what's the right word? Highly toxic, I guess, at least.
Toxic.
And so the need for grace is definitely there. And it's been hard to find. And, people that you wouldn't necessarily, who may not have come on as strong before, are now really stepping up. And to some extent, that's a good thing. And to some extent, that's a bad thing.
Right.
So,
yeah. And then, so all of that has been happening. And then on top of that, we as women, we're still needing to manage all the things that we were already managing, right?
Yeah.
So, we do a lot. I mean, many women are often the primary caretakers of their children.
Mm-hmm.
They're often doing the majority of the housework. They're often doing just a lot of just managing life, keeping people alive, keeping themselves alive. That's just
making
a lot of
sure
times
the family's fed and there's money in the bank account.
Right. And we're making generalizations there. I know not everybody, cooks and cleans and all that. And I'm not a biggest fan of that myself.
I don't love any of that stuff.
Oh, well, yeah. When we sell a lot of merch, maybe we can get like a house cleaner or something.
Oh, that sounds great. Go buy the shirts so I don't have to do the dishes.
I don't know if that's going to motivate anybody to buy a shirt, but
well, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. So what we want to say is, first of all, I think it's just really important to recognize that this year is not normal. I mean, I don't want to say anything about the new normal at all, but I just want to say it's not been normal. And so that has led us to having a lot of challenges that leaders in particular are facing. Yeah. So let's just talk about a few of the challenges that we're seeing ourselves and other leaders having to do.
So, and I think we saw this initially with the onset of COVID and how quickly everything started shutting down, but leaders were really and are still having to sort of pivot their methods very quickly. We saw churches and businesses go from having maybe somewhat of an online presence to almost wholeheartedly having an online presence. And especially for churches, that's been a huge shift. Yeah. And so we as leaders have had to really evaluate how we're connecting with our audience, with the people that we are leading over, our congregations, all of those things. And so it's been almost a turn on a dime. Yeah. It was really fast.
Yeah. And same thing. I mean, businesses have been affected by that as well. So COVID has affected businesses. And then as we think about, the situation with the racism coming to the forefront in our nation's mind, so to speak, a lot of people are really having to shift and change their messaging and talking about things that maybe they weren't talking about at all before. And, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just another thing that you are
trying to navigate,
thinking through and navigating. Yeah. Like you're saying. And then we mentioned this too, but businesses and individuals have experienced a loss of income. Like you said, some people have lost their jobs. Some businesses have had to close down and completely close their doors. And that happens in normal times too, but definitely it's been well beyond the normal in this season of our lives.
Yeah. And I think too, leaders are also dealing with just a general fear and anxiety that is increasing, whether it's within themselves or within family, within those that they're leading. These can be very scary times because it's almost like with every new hour, there's a new news story and it's changing the climate. Sometimes it feels like from minute to minute. And so that general fear and anxiety is just increasing, and it feels like it can feel like it's almost deafening at this point. Yeah. So just trying to manage that and figure out how that is sort of playing itself out within either your own life and heart and mind, and then with those that you lead is just feels like it could be an insurmountable task. And then the other thing that kind of is part of that is feeling the need to respond to everything that's happening. I know, Esther and I were talking earlier today that I have been feeling this exact thing. Am I a bad leader if I don't respond to everything that's happening? And how am I serving those that I lead if I don't kind of come out and say either what I believe in or how I'm navigating things and how do I adjust and navigate all of that? And there's a lot of pressure when it comes to that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And we were kind of talking about that there are there are national crises, there are global crises, there are, natural disasters, all kinds of things that happen on a fairly regular basis. But just lately, it's felt like every other day there's been a new thing,
Yeah, exactly.
And so having that, figuring out how to communicate about those things. And like you said, do I need to post? Do I need to do a social media post or an email or some sort of message to my church body or different things like that every single time that there is a crisis, And so basically this leads us to this question of how do we decide how to respond to crises that are larger than just our immediate families or our immediate lives? How do we individually respond to collective crises as leaders? And there's another factor that we were talking about that's involved in this. And we just did a whole series in May on mental health, right?
Yeah.
And we talked about like how mental health is so important and how it really is something that we need to be talking about more as the church. But what I've been thinking about personally is that going through all of the past few months that we have been, if someone is already having a mental health challenge, say someone is depressed or someone has anxiety or something else that they are dealing with, and then on top of that, you add the COVID thing or the racism thing or the murder hornets thing.
Yeah. We didn't even talk about murder hornets.
Right. That could exacerbate a problem that already exists, and that person, may not have the individual capacity to respond in the way that they are expected to respond, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Yep. And I think as well, another thing that we would also like to consider is that maybe there's a personal health issue for you and your family, or a loved one has passed away, or there's other sort of major challenges that you were already sort of living through. And then all of these things get piled on top, and the pressure just feels, as I said before, just insurmountable, too much to handle. And then it's like that sort of leads you down the road of like, how do I handle all of this and come out as a leader that is, trying to guide people well when I don't even feel like I can handle my own life right now,
Right. Like I'm just thinking about, we've talked before about last fall, and last fall we both went through a lot. You lost your father.
Yep.
I had challenges, and that season felt very heavy and very difficult. And we weren't even dealing with all this stuff.
No,
so
we weren't.
I'm thinking about if we were to like combine those two seasons of life together,
it would have. Know.
Yeah, I don't know either. And so I guess what we want to say is that, the first point I want to make is that, you shouldn't feel guilty or shamed. If that's you right now, if you're feeling like, oh my goodness, like I'm really concerned about all these things going on. I'm really, want to handle this well, but like I can't even hardly get out of bed in the morning right now. Or I am overcome with grief because I lost a loved one, or something else that's very serious, but other people may not see that. They may not even know that's going on in your life.
Right.
To give yourself grace.
Yeah.
And to not feel pressured or shamed or guilted into doing something that you just simply can't take on right now.
Yep. And I think when you're sort of in that place, it creates a lessened capacity to learn, to understand, and to figure out all the nuances of these issues that we're dealing with. When you're already in crisis and when you're already feeling trauma, and we've already made it very clear on this podcast that neither of us are professionals, but having lived through a thing or two, we know that when you get to that point, it almost seems impossible to be able to mentally, healthfully navigate through another topic, another issue, another what feels like crisis. And so if you're already dealing with these things, we just want you to hear us say to give yourself some space and some grace, and to not feel like you have to push the button immediately on that social media post or that topic of of however you reach out to your audience or your congregation, there's grace there. And sometimes you need to ask Jesus to show you how to give it to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of two scripture passages. One, where Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Yeah.
So as believers, yes, we should be very concerned about injustice and about safety and about, there's a lot of things that we should be concerned about. But at the same time, if that's consuming our minds and our heads all the time and we're not living in the freedom that Christ gives us, then there's something wrong there.
Yeah.
And then the other passage I'm thinking about is the fact that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So,
exactly.
My concern is there is a collective crisis. There are several collective crises that we are navigating as a country, as a church, as leaders. But we each have to individually respond in whatever way God has prepared us to do and that we actually have the capacity for. Right. And so we don't want you to sacrifice your mental health for the sake of looking a certain way,
right?
Or coming across in a way that you feel like is going to put you in a good light. Like that's not what we should be doing. And we as leaders also, if we're in a good place and mentally healthy, spiritually healthy, and we feel ready and equipped to take on some of these issues that we're dealing with and we're talking about, and we are passionate, what we need to be careful about is not shaming other people who are not responding in the same way.
Exactly. Because we don't know what any other person or leader is going through. And perhaps that journey from, not feeling ready to feeling ready is either a very long journey that has a lot of different steps to it, or maybe it's a very quick journey.
Yeah.
As you said, if you're in a somewhat good place, you might be able to respond a lot more quickly. But if you already have all the things going on that we mentioned, you may not be ready to respond in any sort of capacity, all too soon. And there's no shame in that. There's no condemnation in that. Yeah. And so we need to be very careful with how we're calling out other leaders on social media, especially is what I'm thinking of, but how we're calling out other leaders, because we don't know what they're going through. And just because we feel emboldened and we've had an experience doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the same place as we are. So, yeah.
I have a story about that.
You do. I'm excited to hear it.
All right. So I've written about this actually on a blog post before, but I'm going to just share it here because I don't think I've shared it on the podcast. But in college, I spent a semester in Costa Rica and I loved it. I mean, it was amazing. It was a life-changing experience. I had traveled and done some missions trips prior to that, but this was 3.5 months of living in a developing country. And during that time in Costa Rica, we traveled to Nicaragua, to Guatemala, and to Cuba. So we did 3 trips for 2 weeks each out of the country. So I had been in 4 different countries during that time. And Costa Rica is somewhat developed, but the other places we went are definitely much more impoverished. And I remember coming home from that, and anybody who has done a missions trip, but especially any longer term trips, about culture shock and about the experience you have when you come home. And one of the biggest challenges I had coming home was it was Christmas time when I got back. And so, I mean, my family has always done Christmas big. My mom loves buying gifts. And I mean, there's just a lot of stuff going on at Christmas time. And I came home saying, I don't want Christmas gifts. We have too much stuff. Everybody needs to get rid of their stuff. What are all these? Why does everybody have such huge houses? I was so affected by what I had seen and the poverty I had seen that I believed that everybody around me should change the way that they're living. Whereas really, I could only make that decision for myself. I could only change my own behaviors and actions based on my experience of what I had seen. Now, what I could do is share the stories of what I had seen and what had happened. And I could tell people how it had affected me. But what I was trying to do was change other people's behaviors by basically guilting them into realizing how good they have it and how horrible other people have it.
Yeah.
So that was something that like God showed me a few years later, like that was not the way to go about trying to generate any kind of change. And that's what I'm thinking now is that, you know, we all are in a different place. And so the people I was talking to and the people I was trying to convince, you know, that they shouldn't buy XYZ or that they shouldn't, you know, have a big materialistic celebration or whatever. What I needed to do was just simply share, hey, here's what I saw. Here's some of the photos I saw. This is some of the photos I took. Here's some of the experiences I had. And this really impacted me. And now I'm thinking about this in a different way.
Yeah.
Versus, you shouldn't do that. That's horrible. You're making the wrong choice, you know?
Right.
Usually it doesn't work. And it says that God's kindness leads us to repentance, not God's shaming guilt trip.
Man, I'm very thankful that is not how things go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, definitely what we are not saying is that we should coddle people into inaction when there are injustices in the world. However, we cannot expect people to have the exact same individual response that we do. And therefore, as Esther said, guilting or shaming into specific action when we don't really know what's on their plate.
Yeah.
All we can do is, as Esther said, share what we know, share our experiences, talk about injustice, and inspire and give people the opportunities to act rather than shaming or guilting into those things.
Yeah.
Because that's not lasting change anyway. You know, people will do things to please and they will go through with the actions just to kind of get you off their back. But that's not lasting change. And what we really need in this specific instance, you know, if we're talking about, you know, racism and the injustices that are happening to people of color, we cannot Band-Aid it. It has to be fixed at a fundamental level, and it has to be core change in individual people and in systematic ways. It has to be laws. It has to be how we're doing things. It can't just be a Band-Aid. And so when we shame others into things, we're only getting an initial response. We're not getting a long-term change.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that we need to remember when we're sort of staking our claim, drawing our line in the sand, how we're actually doing that and whether we're invoking guilt and shame on people rather than inviting them in to a heart mind change about the injustices that are happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I wrote a blog post a couple months ago, right near the beginning of the whole COVID-19 situation, because I was seeing so much happen on social media at that point. And I wrote a post that was kind of talking about how we should respond to crises as leaders. And so I thought we could just hit on a few of the points that I made, but I am going to link to the post because we're not going to like really dive into every point the way I did in the post. And I did get a lot of feedback on the post that people felt it was helpful. And while I did write it in light of the coronavirus pandemic, I think it does the points, I think can be translated to any crisis, any basic idea of what we're facing as a culture, as a church, all of it. So here we go. Let's start.
Okay. So number 1 is don't give in to fear. There are so many verses about fear in the Bible and how we are not supposed to be afraid and how we are to trust in God and his sovereignty and just his plan for our lives and how he does actually have a hand in what's happening in our country. He is not blind to this. And so giving into fear oftentimes will, as I sort of alluded to prior, just result in some sort of really quick changes and sort of maybe not the greatest decisions when we're motivated by fear. We want to have our motives be love and the justice that, you know, God talks about in the Bible. And when we are motivated from fear, I think that we're much more short-sighted.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's number 1. And I think on the flip side too, when we have people that are watching us as leaders, if they are seeing us be very reactionary, that's also not a really great example to be putting out to those people that are sort of watching how we're living our lives. So,
yeah. And I think that one of the biggest sources of fear can be consuming a lot of news media and different, and again, this isn't actually, I'll get to the second point next, which speak to this, but I'm not saying to ignore, but to be aware of the fact that different outlets have different agendas.
Yes.
And I think we can all agree that there's bias in almost every type of news source you can consume.
Yeah.
And so sometimes there is an agenda there to generate fear, to generate panic. And so that's just something to recognize that when you are reading or listening or watching the news or YouTube videos or memes on social media, I mean, sometimes they are there and the result is that it creates more fear.
Yeah.
So to recognize that, to be aware of it can help you to make a better decision on how to respond.
Yeah.
So the second point that is in that post is to be informed, not apathetic. And so I think we can go from one extreme to another. One is consuming everything and being super fearful and freaking out about everything. And the other extreme is, it doesn't really affect me, so I'm not really going to worry about it, And so we were talking about this earlier too, Holly and I, and the fact that I mentioned this on the episode last week with Shannon and in my social media posts that I live in Maine in a very, very white rural area.
Yeah.
And it would be very easy for me to say, well, racism doesn't really affect me, so I don't really need to worry about it. It's not really something that I have to think about, It would be easy for me to be apathetic.
Yes.
And really, I think up until this point in my life, I've been fairly apathetic because I haven't had the people in my life that have had some very difficult experiences that have spoken into me in that. So what is important, I think, for us as leaders, and again, these points that we're talking about are points to help you think about how to respond as an individual, and it's going to look different for each of us.
Yeah.
But to be informed doesn't mean you have to research and read every single thing that every single person recommends to you, because to be quite honest, that would be all consuming all the time.
Yeah.
Even just I've been putting together a list of resources as I've been seeing posts and reading things and, to start becoming more informed about the issue of racism. And every once in a while, when I start to think about it, I kind of start to get overwhelmed because I'm like, oh my word, I literally would have to sit down and read all day long and listen to podcasts all day long if I wanted to really get a grip on this issue.
Yeah.
But I need to find the balance there for myself, and you need to find the balance for yourself on any issue that you want to become more informed about. So,
And I think too, when I think about number one and number two, don't give in to fear. And then number two, be informed and not apathetic. And I'm thinking about it in light of mental health. For me, from an anxiety standpoint, a lot of these things make me really just want to isolate. And that was fantastic when it came to coronavirus, because that was the indication of what we should be doing. But I'm talking about isolating from all of the news. And in general, I don't generally watch the news. If there's something that has kind of come up, I will go look for things and kind of read about it to some extent, but I have to be very careful with what I consume, because even just the tone or how a reporter is talking about things can really feed into that anxiety. And so if you deal with any of those things and you have a tendency to isolate, I would just kind of give you this warning or talk to you about this and say, initially, maybe to counteract those initial feelings of fear and anxiety, perhaps a little isolation is good, but let's try and work past those using the coping mechanisms that you have in place to be able to take this in bite-sized pieces. You do not have to, as Esther said, read everything on the subject, but getting a few trusted sources that you feel really good about reading from is a good idea because we cannot isolate ourselves forever on these things, and we cannot live under a rock. Even though sometimes fear and anxiety and depression drive us there, we have to push past that and move forward. And it's going to look different for every person, but if you can take it in bite-sized pieces, and this actually leads into the next one, but if you can take it into bite-sized pieces and place all of that before the Lord, then it's better than being completely apathetic and completely isolated.
Yeah.
You know, it's moving towards information and understanding of what's going on. So,
and I think that is sometimes where we are seeing some of the criticism towards leaders.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the silence may look like apathy.
Yeah.
And so that is the challenge. That is the tension. And I think that this is something where if you have a business or a church in particular, an organization that's more than just you as an individual, that having a team of people to help during these seasons, because if you are personally, for example, dealing with a mental health issue, but you have a team, then the team can help navigate how should we respond? What should we say? Versus that having to all fall on you.
Right.
So
exactly.
That's one kind of suggestion I'm thinking about in terms of responding to this or any crisis as a team versus trying to handle it as an individual.
Yeah. So our third one is pray. And, as I sort of alluded to, kind of laying all of these fears, even all of the information that you're getting at the feet of Jesus can be very helpful. But praying about how you would respond, praying about how you are going to navigate and sort of sift through all the information is really good. I, this morning, was reading in the story of Esther and in the Bible, and this just so resonated with me because I was having those thoughts of, am I a bad leader because I haven't responded to this? And how am I supposed to be doing this right? And, this was all of our conversation this morning, but I thought that it so went along with this third topic of pray. The part of the story, Mordecai and Esther are kind of going back and forth, and Mordecai comes to find out that there's a plot to basically have destruction of the Jews. And he is pleading with Esther to try to do something about it. And so he says to her, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all of the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai went away and did everything Esther had ordered him. And just as reference, that was Esther 4, and I read from verse 13 through 17. So I just love this because I think this is so relevant to what we're living through.
Yeah.
And I love the sort of discussion between Mordecai and Esther, and we could talk a lot about that. But really what I kind of want to hone in on is the fact that Esther was very reluctant to be a part of this. And she was really reluctant to even go to the king because she could have perished. She could have died. And so once Mordecai kind of convinced her to do this, her first response was fasting and praying. And she asked for people to do that with her. She asked her, I think they were probably handmaids, but she said, my young women, her people closest to her. She asked Mordecai and all of the Jews in that area to fast and pray with her. And the Bible doesn't talk about this, but, she went from being reluctant to going right to the king. So I really feel like this time in prayer was for God to change her heart, to give her the right things, the right motives and ways to do this, and to really get his counsel and his wisdom on how she was supposed to intercede for the Jews in this way. And it sort of reminded me that I need to not be so quick on that response on social media. And in fact, perhaps pray before I do that, because there might be something that God wants to tell me or teach me, or wisdom he wants to give me that will be part of that response. And if I don't do that, I'm missing out on so many things. I'm missing out on a closer relationship with Jesus, but I'm also missing out on his wisdom and his discernment. And I think that these days call for wisdom and discernment. Yeah. And, the biggest ways we can do that is prayer, fasting, and Bible reading. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. So the third point being pray. The next one is refrain from judging other people's decisions.
Yeah.
So, this was something I wrote in the context of the whole, some people might wear masks and some people might not. Mm-hmm. Some people might drive to the grocery store and other people might not. I mean, there was so much going on there in the beginning again. And now we're kind of in a phase of certain places are opening up more and so on, but I'm still seeing it.
Yeah.
I'm still seeing every single day I can find at least one post in my newsfeed where someone is casting judgment on someone else's decision or response to something.
Yeah.
And again, I think we have to really be careful here that as leaders, we point to what we believe to be the right thing to do. We can point to scripture. We can point to our reasons for coming to a decision, but we need to be cautious when something isn't clearly scriptural.
Yeah.
That we're not saying, oh my word, that person is just the worst for deciding to do X, Y, Z.
Right.
It really, we do need to be careful, and we need to think about, if we do want to speak about someone else's decisions, just how we do that.
Yeah.
But I think it's generally a good idea that if it's not straight up against God's word, something that someone's doing, Holly, if you go out and have an affair, I'm probably going to say that was wrong.
That's not right.
No thanks. Right. That's not biblical.
Right.
But if Holly decides to, I don't know, I can't think of a good example of
be silent on the topic. I don't know.
If she doesn't say something on social media, in a certain time frame about racism, am I going to judge her for that? I think it's wise not to. I do. I think it's wise to hold judgment and let that be between that person and God, and be cautious in how quickly we shame or criticize other people for what they're doing, or not doing.
And I think to some extent that goes along with not like what about me. You probably can ascertain that I'm not racist.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if I don't respond as quickly or respond in the way that you think I should, that doesn't mean that I'm racist.
Yeah. Right.
And that's really sort of what's going around right now. Yeah. And it's a hard line to carry, but let that person. So I think we need to let the person either incriminate themselves or not, and then go from there. Judging based on silence is kind of a really rocky place to be. And I don't know that that's really good judgment, good wisdom and discerning. And
again, just to clarify, we're talking about responding as individuals.
Yes.
So we're talking about the individual response. We're not necessarily talking about a response for an organization or a company or a church.
Right.
I do think there is a difference there.
Oh, absolutely.
On that.
Yeah.
But the next point that we have is that we want to support those affected by the crisis.
Yeah.
So again, this can apply to a lot of different situations, but if we're thinking about the racism situation, we want to, as leaders, support people who are hurting.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it is incredibly biblical. It is incredibly part of our calling as Christians to care for one another, to love people, to show care and concern. And so as we respond, we want to consider not just our words, but our actions and the way we're living our lives and the way we are treating people that are affected, whether it's by COVID. There were people affected in a lot of different ways. I mean, what I wrote about in the blog post was, thinking about business owners who had experienced a significant loss during that time, like, are there ways we can support them? I mean, practically speaking, my family has been getting takeout more often so that we can support some of the locally owned restaurants that were affected. And that's a very easy way to support, but on a more serious level, thinking about more significant crises, and whether it's, a natural disaster or the situation with the racism, look for ways that you can practically show love and support, not just through words, because those are pretty empty if they're not followed up with the actions.
And we definitely do not want you to come away from this conversation thinking that we support people turning a blind eye to injustice or persecution. That's definitely not where we are. But we are recognizing the fact that each person is different and may come to their decision with how they're going to act differently and with what they're going to do very differently.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, it's a very real biblical mandate to help those that are persecuted and who are just suffering. I mean, people of color are suffering in our culture, in our country, and we are not to act like that's not happening. We're not to act like this isn't a big deal, because it is a big deal. So definitely in your individual response, if you know people of color that you can reach out to and support, then do it. If there are organizations that you can have boots on the ground or, money to support, then do that. However God prompts you to respond and to engage with people in their hurt and suffering, then do it. But I guess what we're trying to say is that everyone will come to it in a different way, in a different,
Yeah, for sure.
So the last point is lead with wisdom, not hype. And this requires real discernment. And honestly, I think that, and this might not be, the reason for doing it, but it does earn you a lot of respect when you can come to a decision or a response, something that you are actually going to put out there for people to see and read. When that is bathed in prayer and discernment, you can tell. And when you don't feed into the hype and you don't respond using cliches that people have started throwing out there, and you really come to a very thoughtful response, people can tell. And those that follow your lead will generally respond to that with a lot more trust and a lot more loyalty, if you will, to your leadership. And I think in the end, we do a disservice to our testimony and to the Christian faith when we just respond really quickly with a lot of hype and a lot of maybe even the terms that are socially out there and what's current, rather than with wisdom and discernment.
Yeah. And you mentioned it earlier, but the need for us as believers, as we navigate any crisis, but especially crises that impact culture and the church in particular, to really make sure we're in God's word, to make sure we are having that relationship with God. And I loved, again, what Shannon said last week on the episode, because she talked about, asking God to search your heart and talking to him about what's going on. And because we have blind spots, right?
Absolutely.
We have spots in our own lives, but as we lead, to go out there and lead without those knee-jerk reactions is important. And so there's definitely a balance. And like we said, you're probably going to look around and you're going to see different leaders. You're going to see some leading through crises and you're going to say, wow, they are doing an amazing job. And that's what I would like to do. And then you might see others that they're not doing so hot and they're fumbling a lot and maybe they're making a lot of missteps or they're just handling things very poorly. Maybe consider, rather than tearing them apart on social media, consider praying for them and consider asking God to lead you in a way that you will not do the same thing.
Yeah.
Because I think we all have the potential to completely mess things up in how we respond. And that's why we all need the grace. We need the grace that God gives us. We need the grace from each other. And we just need to be recognizing that the way that I am responding to XYZ crisis, situation, emergency, it's going to look different than the way my friend does or the way that the person at the church up the street does.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily make their choice wrong. And it doesn't make my choice right.
Yeah.
Those are our thoughts for today.
That was heavy, man.
Oh, heavy, but also, I don't know.
I think it was a needed conversation.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I'm seeing so many things out there saying, you need to do this and you need to do that. And if you're not doing this, then you are XYZ. Yeah. And the pressure is heavy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it brings us back to really, making sure that what we are saying and what we are listening to, that we're filtering it through the lens of is that actually true?
True. Yeah.
Is that true? Truth? And is that truth? Is that God? Is that God's voice or is that a different voice?
Yeah.
And that we are recognizing that and learning to pay attention to that. So if you want to be part of this conversation, if you want to chime in with your thoughts, if you disagree with us, we don't shy away from disagreement.
No, we don't.
As long as it's done respectfully.
Yes, exactly.
And, not tearing people apart. I don't endorse that. But certainly we would love for you to be part of the conversation and come on into our Purposeful Leadership Facebook group. We always post about the episode and we love to hear your input and your feedback.
Yeah.
And, again, like Holly said, we're not experts. We don't have the last say on anything really, but this is our podcast. So we do kind of get to say what we want on it.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do.
Oh, goodness.
Gosh.
So maybe we should wrap up with our fun question.
Yes. But before we do that, I want to just encourage you to go read the blog post that we sort of talked through today.
Yes.
I think it's really important. We expanded on each of these topics, but it's really important for you to go read that blog post as well. And of course, that will be in the show notes.
Yeah.
But, it's a good idea to kind of just review all of that before you are putting your responses out there in the world.
Yeah, I'll link that. And actually, I'm going to link one other post, which I did share the story in another blog post about the whole coming home from my time in Costa Rica. And that post was really about how we can share our personal convictions without becoming legalistic.
Oh,
and so it really kind of goes in line with a lot of what we talked about today too. Yeah. So I'll link that one up.
Okay.
So yeah.
So let's wrap up with a little bit of fun because we need some levity.
Mm-hmm.
So our fun question for today is, what's one summer activity that you cannot wait to do?
Okay. Am I answering it first?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have actually already been diving into summer activities because I love summertime here in Maine. But one that I'm excited to do that I haven't done yet is really be able to go to the coast with some friends.
Yeah.
Because we haven't really done much for outings with friends lately.
Right.
And so I really love going on like day trips with friends and their kids, and we kind of do a hike or go to the ocean. So I definitely want to do that, and I'm hoping it's going to be doable here sometime soon. What about you, Holly?
Well, so I'm waiting for summer to arrive.
Oh, yeah. Because Maine is being dumb right now, and we're having cold weather.
Maine is cold in comparison to Florida. Yes. I would never come here and say, ooh, it's cold, because I've lived through Maine winter, and I know it's not actually cold here. But it's not warm. So once it warms up, so I love swimming at the lake. We're on the lake all summer anyway, but it's not warm enough to do that yet. But the thing that I really love is kayaking. And we have not gotten our kayaks out yet just because we've been getting set up and, quarantining and all of those things. And trying really hard to follow the rules and all of that stuff. But once that is out, I will be on the water in that kayak. I love it because it's so calming and it's peaceful, and it's just really nice to sort of go around and look at nature that's all around. But it's also fun to snoop around and look at other people's camps. Because it's really weird when you drive your boat right up to someone else's camp and you're like looking at their camp and like, oh, cool.
Scoping it out.
But when you're on a kayak, you're much slower.
You can totally
spy on creep on people's camps. So I like to do that because I like to see how different people have things set up and, all the different fun little things that they do. And some of these are family camps, and you can kind of tell that they've been passed on for generation to generation, and they have some really cool stuff at them, but they're, hidden. And I like to find the little...
So Holly really is just...
I'm a creeper.
Looking forward to be a creepy stalker person. Oh, gosh.
I like to creep on the animals, too.
Yeah. Well, that's
There's
what I like
animals.
the most when I go kayaking and paddleboarding, because I also have a paddleboard, which I haven't taken out. I should say I don't have a kayak. I only have a paddleboard. Just to clarify, we have kayaks.
You have all the
family kayaks that we can use. But anyway, I like paddleboarding. But like you said, it's easier to like sneak up on wildlife when you're down low in the kayak.
Yes.
They don't really notice you as much.
Although we have an otter that is in the lake. Yeah, well, there's lots of inlets and stuff like that.
Not a beaver, an otter?
I'm pretty sure it's an otter.
Oh, my word.
Is that wrong?
Well, there's like...
A beaver has a wide flat tail.
Yeah.
He does not have a wide flat tail. But otters can be really nasty. So I saw an otter one time. I was pretty close to the shore, and it jumped off of a rock, and it swam towards me, and I was scared out of my mind because all I could picture was those viral videos where there's like an otter on someone's kayak or like a seal or something, which I think would be totally cool, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid of animals in general.
Yes. I do remember a viral video that I sent to you with otters, and you were freaking out about it because you were worried that was going to happen to you.
Yes, because he swam. I'm pretty sure he swam like right underneath my kayak.
Yeah. Okay, so this is going off the rails here at the end, but one of the things that you and I have talked about a few times is like maybe having an event at some point.
Oh yeah.
For
I would
women,
love to do that.
And whenever I do Instagram stories, which by the way, come follow me on Instagram.
Yeah.
But I do Instagram stories. I'm not that great with the posting, but I do sometimes stories, and I often do it when I'm out like in Maine hiking, and I almost always get replies like, "Oh my word, it's so beautiful there. I'd love to go visit." So I'm thinking, tell us somehow. Email me or post in the group if you would like to have an event. And if we have an event, should we do it in Maine or Florida? Because I feel like we could do it either place and have an amazing time.
This is true. I would love to meet we can meet all of our listeners.
All of you.
But we want to meet a lot of our listeners in person.
That would be super fun.
That would be so fun. And if you could experience nature.
Yes. They might be freaked out now by the otter story, though.
Well, let me just say, for animals that could hurt, bite, or kill you, there are much less of those in Maine than there are in Florida.
That's true.
We have a coyote that's living behind our house right now.
In Maine?
No.
Right. In Florida. What?
Coyotes. They have bear. There's crocodiles. There's venomous snakes.
Yeah.
There was a snake on our dog. Did I tell you that? My husband was walking. Sorry, people. My husband was walking our dog, and his back leg was like off the ground. He was like shaking it as Zach was walking him. And he looked down, and there was a small snake wrapped around his back leg. And he shook enough, and the snake fell off and like slithered into the grass.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, it was a small snake, but still. It
was on your dog.
It was on our.
It's
and
crazy.
so. You should have seen us out at nighttime holding the dog and like feeling him from head to toe, making sure there was no more snake. Like and I was in my pajamas on our back like lawn. There was lights. It was crazy, but
okay. People,
okay. So we really need to wrap it up.
Give us your vote. First, should we have an event? And
one, and then B.
One, should we have an event? B, where should it be?
There you go. That's why you said that.
That's right. All right. Well, thanks for hanging with us today on this episode, and we will talk to you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.